I'm really sorry. Hello, thank you guys for coming out tonight. First things first, if everybody wants to turn off their cell phones, that would be great. But yes, this is our first event for the Colson-Whitehead visit that's going to be happening on September 12th. I'm sure that all of you guys know, but just in case, we have a full schedule of events in Bath. But he's going to be here for a reception at 5 o'clock, and then he's going to be giving a convocation at Illinois College at 7 o'clock. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Dr. Alonzo Ward. He is the Assistant Professor of History at Illinois College. He's going to help give some context for the alternative history that Colson-Whitehead writes about in the Underground Railroad. He's going to discuss the African American experience up to the Civil War. He's going to touch on the actual Underground Railroad, some of the roles of Illinois abolitionists, particularly after the infamous 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. So if everybody can give a round of applause for Dr. Alonzo Ward.
Hillary, I took the long path so I can get a longer applause. Very cheap on my part. I apologize. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for showing up here. This is a great crowd. I expected maybe 3 people, and I got maybe. No, I'm not kidding you. And I told Hillary as I saw this crowd, I said, well, I'm a little bit nervous now. And I wasn't before, but now I am. So we'll deal with it. Like Hillary said, what I'm going to try to do is condense about 250 years of history into about under an hour. So you all are guinea pigs because I usually save this for an entire semester's worth of classes. And so you're getting this in under an hour. Hopefully we'll have a chance to ask questions, answer questions afterwards because I'm going to go pretty fast here. So bear with me here. So the African American experience, let me make sure this works. Oh, this is great. The African American experience up to the Civil War will obviously be dominated by slavery. But this roughly 230 to 50 year period also witnesses the growth of a small but vibrant black free community as well too. And so I'll touch a little bit upon that as well too. As well, also a relatively energetic and quite competent protest society as well too. And you'll see that this free group of people actually had a lot to do with the Underground Railroad and the general abolitionist society as well too. So my goal this evening is to cover this period under an hour, like I said. Good luck. I'll do my best, yes. One of the things I'd like to do when I'm discussing this era is really to help destroy the myths that come with slavery and blacks during the Antebellum period. Slavery in North America was initially not intended to be a permanent venture, first and foremost. That it was a venture, an economic venture, a profit-seeking venture that actually was biracial. And it was not permanent. It was the earliest parts of it had to do with indentured servitude rather than permanent slavery. And so I'll cover parts of this as well too. So this is straight from my IC class. I didn't change a thing. And this is pretty small here, and I apologize too, so I'll read some of this to you. But what I separate slavery, and this is just the table of contents that I'm gonna go through really quickly here, but I separate this in phases, 3 phases of slavery that I consider. The origins of North American slavery from the 16th to the early 18th century, and within that moment, we look at indentured servitude and the actual legalization of slavery as well too. And when I say legalization, you'll understand this to mean the actual racialization of slavery, which it was not initially. The second phase, and this is really the beginning of racialized slavery or black slavery, if you will, starting in the 18th century roughly. And you have early permanent slavery, and then you'll see some regional differences too. So one of the other myths that I like to debunk early on in my classes at least is the idea that slavery was the same everywhere. That it was the same in New York City as it was in, say, Georgia, which it clearly was not because of the crop differences and the weather differences and the just the differences in a lot of different reasons. The final phase is what I consider the most popular one, and I think it's the one that most people are familiar with. When we think of slavery, we generally think of cotton, we think of picking cotton, and we think of Mississippi and Alabama, maybe Texas or Florida. But this is Southern slavery during the 19th century, and you'll see the invention of the cotton gin, how important cotton was, and you'll see life on the plantation as well too. And again, you'll see a lot of familiar things as well too. Finally here, I'm going to cover some free African Americans as well too, northern black communities, specifically about black resistance, and specifically runaways and revolts, and lastly, the Underground Railroad as well too. So I start with, I don't know how that got there. I start with this here too, just to give you, sorry about that, an idea of, and again, I apologize for the small writing here, so I'm going to be reading this to you here too, but just to give you an idea of what took place when black Africans were first brought here. Roughly 1619, 1620, the dates are disputed. Some people even take it further back to, say, 1560. Whatever the case, the earliest blacks and some of the earliest whites that were brought here or that voluntarily came here in the European case worked under an indentured servitude system. And this was a system in which people would work for 4 to 7 years, basically voluntarily. And I use voluntarily in kind of quotations because these people were poor in many cases, in the European cases, and they were trying to work off debts. And so they, part of their way of coming over to the new land was to work off a 4 to 7 year debt. And Africans that were brought over, who in many cases, in most cases, the Africans were actually captured. And I'm going to discuss one of the examples here in a second here. They were actually captured, but nevertheless, they were not permanent slaves in most cases early on. That changes, and we'll get into those changes pretty soon here. There's my guy. In approximately 1620, a man from Angola, this young man that you see right here, handsome fellow, from Angola was captured by an enemy tribe and sold into slavery. He was held in what amounts to a clearinghouse for about a year in Angola, or on the coast of Africa, near Angola, and was eventually sold to the Virginia Company as an indentured servant. By 1621, he was brought to Virginia and given the name Antonio. Let's see if I have that there. Let's see if I have my Angola here, so you see where that is at least. There we are again. Here's our guy, yes. He was given the name Antonio, and the way they did it back then, apparently he was not given a surname anytime soon, and so they listed him as Antonio the Negro. And that was common too, so obviously if you were African descent, that was your surname, the Negro. Now, Antonio was sold to a white planter named Bennett. His last name was Bennett, I don't have his first name. Again, as an indentured servant to work on his Virginia tobacco farm. He worked side by side with other servants, and as I mentioned before, some of those servants that he worked with on this tobacco farm were white. And there was no hierarchy on this farm. You know, if you work with your white brothers and sisters and you work with your, that was it. And we're gone. But that's not good. Uh-oh. Anything? What we got going there? There we go. All right, I'll continue. And again, he works near the indentured servants on this farm. And some historians suggest that he worked for approximately 20 years. That's significant in the respect that even at this early date, they were differentiating the amount of time that the Africans would work compared to, say, the white indentures. So most of the white indentures would work for 4 to 7 years, and there was very little variation from that. Even at this early point, oh well, that's too bad. Even at this, Antonio's gone. That's okay. That's all right. But even we'll get him back, I'm sure. But even at this early date, you start to see a very small but distinguished a distinction rather between these two groups.
I have a question real quick. In Africa, when they captured the black people, who are the capturers that are selling them?
Well,
who are they?
Physically, in Antonio's case, he was actually captured by an enemy tribe. However, what I tell my students, and I never want anybody to get it confused, that these were Europeans that were behind the actual capturing, and so they actually ran the entire system, even though there were actual physical Africans that were taking him to be captured. Okay.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right. So during his contract, wherever he is, Antonio, come back, please. During his contract for 20 some odd years, he met and married another indentured servant by the name of Mary. The following year, in 1623, approximately in 1640, Antonio and Mary gained their freedom. And after gaining their freedom, they actually were granted a plot of land, and this was typical of indentured servants. People that know about indentured servitude, they actually gave you something for your service, like a gold watch for retirement, I guess. I don't know. And I'll show you too, whenever Antonio comes back up here, but I'll tell you, Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson. I don't know why that would be significant, but at least he had some ownership over who he wanted to be and why he chose Johnson. I have no idea, but according to the records and the evidence, yeah, Anthony Johnson is who he becomes, and I assume his wife becomes Mary Johnson. I'm assuming that. So this is interesting too, and what I really want to display here with this early story is that unlike later, say 50 years later, maybe even not that long later, Anthony Johnson, after he gained his freedom, after he earned his freedom from indentured servitude, he was actually able to live amongst the regular the white population in relative peace. In 10 years, he doubled his land. So the land that he was granted, whatever they gave him, and they gave him like a bushel of, my God, there he is. He reemerges like a ghost. No, it's fine. It's fine. But he doubles his land. And again, I'm telling this story about Anthony Johnson because we have this evidence on Anthony Johnson, but my historians and me and other people that know this, we contend that this was not unusual. This was relatively typical. So it's also important to note too that he didn't live off in some secluded or racially segregated area in the, where the ghetto, quote unquote. He lived in the smack dab in the middle of everyone else. They also enjoyed similar economic and political status as their white neighbors, too. Again, this is very common at this time. This changes, however. That's just a spoiler alert there, too. Johnson was the foremost example in early Virginia of a black man who emerged from servitude to become a tobacco planter himself. In fact, he had indentured servants himself, too. So he actually owned slaves, if you want to make it technical as well, too. They participated fully in the commercial and legal life of the colonies, and again, they owned land and all this stuff. They voted and everything. So thus, before the 1670s, the English in the Chesapeake did not draw a strict line between white freedom and black slavery. However, since the early 1600s, the ruling elite had treated black servants differently, as I showed that I messed him up. Anthony Johnson actually worked a little bit longer than everybody else, apparently, and that was pretty typical, although it wasn't always the case, but in his case, I guess his master said, no, you're going to work 20 years, you sign this contract or whatever you have to do, and that's it. So over the decades, the region's British population gradually came to assume that persons of African descent were alien. This is a gradual thing. This isn't something, and so what I try to tell my students as well is if you want to understand how the origins of racism happens in America, it doesn't start right away. It's something that gradually takes place over time. And the sentiment of him being an alien, Anthony Johnson or other people of African descent being alien, is not even universal, and in particular, it's not universal among middling or poor whites. Not yet. It will be, but not yet. So, we'll get to no, it's that, Hillary. The significant step here of this transformation, and some historians call it a terrible transformation, I think it's aptly named too, but the legalization of slavery the legalization of slavery coincides with racialized slavery. Starting in the 1660s, slave codes and other racial restrictions hardened as colonial leaders began to fashion legal structures designed to lock people of African descent into chattel slavery. And that's a very new word at this moment, but it's one that will become very well known to the elite planners, of course. Chattel slavery being what we know of as permanent slavery. And so the following are factors that led to this transformation. I've always wanted to find this out. We do a little digging as historians, but these are some of the things that led to the transformation to black slavery, this idea of chattel slavery, this permanent slavery, this racialized slavery. First, by the 1670s, fewer and fewer English men and women proved willing to indenture themselves for long-term service in the Chesapeake region. They just didn't want to do it. They didn't have to do it anymore, for a variety of reasons. Some of these will come out too. Secondly, there was an increase in the death rate and a reduction in the birth rate amongst the Europeans, and so therefore there's just less people to come to the colonies. Also, population pressures had eased in England, and the founding of the Restoration colonies meant that people would choose other American destinations. And so they wouldn't necessarily go to Virginia anymore, for example, or Maryland, where the tobacco colonies were at their peak, or at least they were growing faster than other slave colonies. Also, fluctuating tobacco prices and the growing scarcity of land made Chesapeake less appealing to potential immigrants. So therefore, if you were an aspiring indentured servant, but the master says, oh, by the way, we can't guarantee the land, we used to guarantee all the other indentures, you might not be inclined to come over either. It's like, I'm not working for these people. So what happens is Virginia begins to structure a new legal code that sanctioned the perpetual slave condition and the inferior position of all people of African descent. And you can actually start to see this ball starting to roll even as early as Anthony Johnson's time there. But what happens is that, and most infamously, by 1662, Virginia law states that the free or slave status of children born into the colony would depend on the condition of their mother. So if your mother was a black slave, or if she was a slave, then the child would also be a slave. In 1667, they removed all opportunity for gaining freedom on religious grounds. So at one point, if you became a Christian, for example, as an African, you would just be completely released from your duties. And that changed too. Also, neighboring Maryland outlawed marriage between slaves and freeborn English women, so interracial marriage was outlawed. So again, you can see how the laws themselves were actually, for lack of a better term, they're implicating or they're inferiorizing, that didn't sound right either. They were degrading black people, the laws themselves. Okay? So perhaps the death knell to black freedom in this case, during this period, and this is probably the key here, and the subsequent implementation of harsher racialized laws would be the 1676 uprising started by an English planter who had recently arrived in Virginia. He became quite upset at the colonial government. This young man is named Nathaniel Bacon. So anybody that's familiar with Bacon's Rebellion, it's like, what's that got to do with anything? Well, Nathaniel accused the government of failing to protect settlers. Actually, settlers from the raids from local indigenous peoples, the Susquehannocks, I believe the names were, and I can't remember the Dogs, I can't remember their names specifically, but a couple of Native American groups were rabble-rousing. The royal governor, Sir William Berkeley, had in fact signed a treaty with the local indigenous groups, and young Nathaniel Bacon riled up the Virginia public. The problem with this, as far as the elite were concerned, and the governor, who was also the elite, the problem as far as they were concerned is not that a revolution and starting all this was all bad, the rebellion. But it was quite common back then in the 1600s and the 1700s. The problem was for them is that he riled up this group of biracial, not only biracial, but they were bi-class too, if that makes sense too. But they were of the middling classes and poor people, black slaves and white slaves, small farmers that were white and black farmers that were white. And this outraged and put the fear of God into the elite. And so they came up with something. They eventually squelched the rebellion. It was no big deal. Nathaniel Bacon died before the thing was over, and the rest is history. But as far as the ruling class and government were concerned, yeah, the troubling part of this was that mixture, that group. And so the rebellion was eventually squelched, like I said, but one historian noted that one of the last groups to surrender, this is part of the trouble too, one of the last groups to surrender in this rebellion were these African Americans, or these free blacks. And they happened to be mixed with these small farmers, small white farmers as well too. Again, a troubling development, really, to say the least. So in the last 2 decades of the 17th century, you witness an unprecedented growth in harsh statutes to reinforce slavery and the inferiority of blacks, harsher punishments for crime versus black slaves, brandings, whippings, maimings, and all this was relatively new. All of this was relatively new to this period. And one of the lessons I try to teach from this story, or this period of time, when slavery was still very uncertain. It was uncertain that it would be an all-black phenomenon. It was uncertain that it would be a permanent phenomenon. It was uncertain that it would be such a harsh phenomenon as well. But at this moment here, things are starting to change, and I mentioned the Bacon's Rebellion, for example, and how in 1676, yeah, this makes a difference. And it makes a difference on the elite, the people who own slaves, most importantly. All right, so I'm going to jump ahead to the second phase here. Click, see here. Stop it. The second phase is distinguished by the development of a distinct regional differences in racial slavery in the 18th century. So we're looking at basically the 18th century here. During this phase, Americans gained independence, as everybody should know. I'm talking to you as if you were my undergrads, and I'm not sure all of them know that either. But, so that might have been a note from that, as a matter of fact. So this is important too about the revolution that I don't think a lot of people understand. People began to question the morality of slavery, and they, in conjunction with their own freedoms, like, hey, we're kicking the Britishers behind, and we're getting our freedom. And then the slaves are like, yeah, what are we doing here? And in many cases, free blacks and black slaves wanted to fight in the revolution, and you'll see how that works out too with our guy George Washington in a second here. Also, there were too many powerful men with heavy involvement with the institution itself for them to actually abolish it. That's the bottom line here. And so when people ask me, so, with all the goodwill that happens after the American Revolution, why doesn't it go away? Why doesn't slavery end? We kicked the British out, and they're the ones that started slavery. Well, I said, no, it's not quite that simple, because there was a lot of American involvement in slavery, in slave plantations. Those were American slave owners, in the South and in the middle colonies as well too. They weren't all British. In fact, many of them weren't British, as a matter of fact. But let me go through this very quickly here. Just some of the distinctions between the different regions here. For example, New England, where there were very few black people that lived, yet slavery was important to the region's commercial life. New Englanders became the foremost shippers and carriers of goods for colonial America, sailing cargo vessels between the mainland North American colonies, the West Indies, the British Isles, and later Africa. So a very important region as far as slavery was concerned, even though there weren't a lot of African Americans there. And like I said, the population itself was only 2% in the entire region itself. The mid-Atlantic colonies, this was really a hodgepodge of different peoples, Dutch, Irish, just a large group of languages, and yeah, more African Americans there. The New York colony, for example, had the most slaves in the North in the 18th century, a large increase during this century. You can start to see the beginnings of of black community life. They actually had festivals at the time that they were still slaves, but they were still allowed to have some fun, I guess. Slave labor in the cities is very important for this region. Households and crafts and maritime industry. And I'll make one distinction here about the middle colonies as well too, is that Pennsylvania was quite unique in that you had the beginnings of what will become an abolitionist culture with the Quakers and the Society of Friends as well too. Even though they owned slaves, or not the Quakers themselves, but even though slaves were owned in Pennsylvania, you start to see the abolition movement grow very quickly in Pennsylvania. Now let me get back to the Chesapeake very quickly, because this is probably the most important region as far as slavery is concerned. And again, what I tell my undergrad students is that, we think about slavery, we think about Mississippi and Alabama. I said, no, that's not here yet. That ain't here yet. I said, give it some time. We'll get to the third phase, and then we'll get to that period. But the Chesapeake, the tobacco region, is the most important and the most profitable, and that's where you have the most African Americans as slaves. Dominated by tobacco plantations. And just to give you an idea of the dominance, by 1750, there was 144,000 slaves that lived in Virginia, and that's 61% of all slaves in all colonies, just to say, again, the dominance itself. It's also important to note that unlike the sugar colonies of the Caribbean, where white people were a tiny minority, they constituted a majority in the tobacco colonies and a large minority in the rice colonies as well, which I'll get to in a second here as far as the rice colonies. Also, most white Southerners did not own slaves, right? Most. But the economic development of the region depended heavily upon slave labor, and therefore, even poor whites in some way benefited from the institution itself. And so finally here in the low countries, South Carolina, Georgia, south of tobacco colonies itself, they developed a very distinct slave society. Rice was the staple crop. Rice. By 1740, the Carolina Low Country had 40,000 slaves, and that constituted, and this was incredibly insane, it constituted 90% of their population. 90% of their population was black slave population. And let me say this too, the 10% of that white population that lived there always feared rebellions, always. In fact, famously, the Stono Rebellion takes place down there a little bit later, but they always feared rebellions in that area, and they had good reason to have this fear as well, too. Okay, how are we doing? Oh! I don't know. Yes, I agree. Let me see, wait, hold on. Let me catch up to where I am. I have no idea where I am on these slides. Let's see if that works. Oh my goodness, it's so far back. I'm thinking about just leaving it out. I don't know if I need it anymore. There's my guy. Oh man. Chesapeake, we just talked about that, right? I had a lot to say about the Chesapeake, by the way. There's Carolina. We just got off of this, right? Yeah. There we go. Well, you got an idea of the rice paddies. And by the way, let me say this too, about the Georgia and South Carolina, because I don't think it gets enough credit for how bad it was. This is disgusting labor. You're wet all day, and yeah, it just wasn't good. Slaves died all the time in Georgia and in South, all the time. I mean, it was just incredible how much disease they encountered in this particular region. And it's not to say they didn't die in other places like Virginia, where it was very harsh labor as well too, but this was particularly harsh because of the disease. It had nothing to do with the punishment that they would incur from their masters either. Okay. Just a quick shout on black culture. I'll come back to this later in the third phase of this. What I found interesting about this is that biblical names were not quite in vogue for black slaves, so they didn't necessarily take on the names that will become common to African Americans later, and especially in the third phase of slavery during the 19th century. During this time, which I didn't know this at one point very recently, that they tended to, black slaves at this point tended to still gravitate towards their, at least some modicum of their own African religions. I mean, it wasn't quite Christianity, and it also was closer to Islam as well too. And I found that really interesting too, and I didn't know that, as a matter of fact. One of the major turning points for African Americans as far as religion is concerned, and you'll see this later too, is that the Great Awakening happens, in which there's this large Christian revival throughout the country, and many masters were starting to convert their slaves to Christianity, thinking that this would somehow be good for them, I guess. Oh, yeah, whatever, but yeah, that's what they did. And so, yeah, this large Christian black population starts to develop. Now I mentioned the Revolutionary War. My guy here, Crispus Attucks. I threw this in at the last second because if I mention the Revolutionary War, the first person to get shot in the Revolutionary War has to be mentioned, that he just happened to be African American. He's actually biracial. Crispus Attucks. He was actually a runaway slave of mixed descent, led a protest that was later termed to be the Boston Massacre. First person shot. I figured I'd give him some credit at least. So what happened? So in fighting the war here, what happens when African Americans go to war for their independence? It's the question I ask. The debate over emancipating slaves was front and center, right? And you start to see petitions and lawsuits initiated by black people, by free blacks, for slaves, saying that, yeah, we should all be free. Blacks should all be free. In fact, black slaves were actually petitioning for their freedom as well. This was in the North, though, where they had a little bit more autonomy. They didn't let them do that kind of stuff in the South, though. Okay? And so, yeah, this is important here, too. Free black men had been banned from militia service as early as 1656. And that wasn't always the case. There were still blacks fighting in the 7 Years' War, I believe, and some other wars up until that point. But the bottom line is that General George Washington, he forbade the enlistment of new black troops and the re-enlistment of black men who had served in Lexington and Concord and other battles. He did this because the colonies had traditionally excluded African Americans from militia service. The fears were obvious. They feared giving arms to black men, and just some of the stuff that you pretty much figured to this day. It would also encourage slaves to leave their masters without permission. I can understand that too. If I had a gun all of a sudden, and I might not be so inclined to go back anymore. Right? Okay. And they were still called on to fight. They fought in the 7 Years' War. I mentioned this already as well too. I don't know where I went from there. And so, yeah, General Washington's first stance is to say no to blacks into the military. This changes, however, and I love how it changes, because the British royal governor, the last one here, says, hey, by the way, the ones that you won't take, we'll take every single one of them. And by the way, we'll give them their freedom. I don't know who wouldn't take that opportunity. I mean, I may have been loyal to my American buddies and my masters or whatever, but if somebody's offering me my freedom, yeah, I'm going. So I'm going to the loyalists, the British side. And many black slaves did actually, in fact, go to their side. But what you saw is that George Washington, I'm sorry, I'm going too fast now. That's ironic. George Washington, as a result, says, okay, I was just kidding about that, and says, okay, we're going to let blacks come into the military and fight for us and die for us. That's great. And so they do, and so many of them become heroes and all that stuff. And in some cases, they actually did get their freedom, their manumission as a result of fighting. However, both the American side and the British side pretty much squelch on their promise that many African Americans ended up either being returned to their former slave masters or just being sold back into slavery afterwards. It wasn't a very good promise. It wasn't one that was kept very well too. I'm not sure where I have this slide here, Emancipation and Slavery in the early Republic. I just wanted to show this, but clearly it's too small for you guys to see. I'm going to move on here to my free black community here. There you go. Sorry about that. The emergence of free black communities. The advent of large black populations in the North and Upper South after the Revolution allowed African Americans to establish autonomous and dynamic communities. Namely, in the North in particular, you see this in places like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Rhode Island, New York, and Boston. And you start to see the independent churches begin to develop. And I won't belabor the point, but the importance of the black church to this group, this particular era, and you'll see this throughout American history, the importance of the black church, and that's Epsilon Jones, one of the early black leaders of the church, and subsequently black leaders as well too, and Richard Allen as well. For black communities at this time, and you'll see this later as well, and anybody that knows anything about Martin Luther King and any other black movements were almost always connected to the black church, and that starts at this point. And so you see benevolent societies, you'll see schools that are started inside these churches as well too. Okay. One thing, and I almost left this out here, the black laws. And this is something that is specific to northern states. I love telling my students that because everybody's prejudiced in the South. No. The black laws were instituted in the North. In fact, the South later, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, they copied the Northern black laws. They copied them. They said those were good. Those were good discriminatory laws. We like them, so we'll take them. Those were really good. These laws were developed in northern states as early as the 1790s to prevent blacks their total rights, and also to prevent them from coming into their states as well. I got two. Ohio, 1804 to 1849, had a series of black laws. They kept improving them, quote unquote. And our great state of Illinois, where's it at? Oh, there. From the time the state was developed, all the way up into the Civil War. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah, this happened. That's late time. That's late for Illinois. This is Lincoln's home and all that fun stuff. But yeah, black laws. And so these black laws were meant to keep blacks out of the state. They were meant to not allow them to vote, not allow them to serve in the military, not allow them to sit on juries. What other fun stuff? That about covers it. Also, so with all of that, you see the advent of disenfranchisement, so the voting rights were taken away. So in places like New York and Pennsylvania and other northeastern states, you actually had African Americans that had voting rights. Those were taken away. So that's something. So if you never have the rights, that's one thing, and you can't miss what you didn't have. But no, they had the rights at one point. They had them taken away in the Northeast in particular. So these are the changes that are taking place in the North, not in the South. That's significant during this particular the second phase of slavery. This is the part of slavery that most people are familiar with, and if you know anything about history, you know about that guy. And I joke, that's the cotton gin, yes. I joke with my students all the time. I say, if there was one invention that black people did not want to see, it would be that one. Because what this invention does, as great as it was, and actually I don't think Eli Whitney had this whole idea of extending slavery in mind. I really don't think he did. I don't think that was like, how can I expand slavery? But what happens is that this invention in 1793 basically opens the door for a new way to earn money in slavery, because the dominant crop was tobacco at one point, right? Yeah. Tobacco. That changes after 1790. In fact, smart people like Thomas Jefferson, he wrote about this in the Notes of Virginia, talked about how slavery was a dying institution. And we know he knew because he had 200 slaves himself. Yeah, so he knew. And so, yeah, Eli Whitney comes up with this great invention. Thank you, Eli. So what ends up happening is that cotton production rises from 3,000 bales to about 178 bales, 178,000 bales by 1810. So in a small span of about 20 years, I can't even do the math on that, from 3,000 bales to 178,000 bales, this was the United States' greatest export. And you know who was buying all this stuff up, don't you? Britain. Great Britain, of course. Jeez. So I start that watershed moment. That starts the third phase of slavery. And so what makes that distinct? Because again, if slavery is a dying institution, that they're dealing in the rice paddies in Georgia and South Carolina, they're dealing in tobacco in the Chesapeake, and quite frankly, I didn't mention this, but they're starting to abolish slavery in the North. In places like New York, like, that's enough of that. We'll institute the black laws to keep them out of our state, but at least we'll stop slavery because we think it's wrong. So the goodwill was kind of wilting at best. All right, and so you can't see that because I'm really bad at making slides, but this is going to cover the 19th period here, 19th century, I'm sorry. And so what I say here is that, by this period, the period that we're all familiar with, and we see in Roots and all kinds of documentaries and stuff, slavery is a very old institution by this time. It's old, it's outdated, but it's revived because of that damn cotton gin. Completely revived. The South becomes the largest and most powerful slave society in the world by this time. And this was not the case. Mississippi Territory and Alabama and Texas, they had nothing to do with slavery. But what happens is that old tobacco farmers, in some cases, pick up and move to the South. That's enough of the tobacco stuff, because tobacco, for anybody that knows about crops like tobacco, it's very hard on the soil. It's very hard on the soil. It's not very profitable, quite frankly. Well, that changes with cotton here. And so the South develops a monopoly on cotton. So you know all this stuff here, right? Not good. And this goes right along with the initial industrial revolution. That again, this profit-driven phenomenon is bigger than ever. So now slavery is bigger than ever. Cotton is bigger than ever, and this industry is bigger than ever. Triple the size it was with tobacco. Most importantly, though, is that, I know you guys can't see this very well here, but the distribution of the slave population. So what happens is essentially a second Middle Passage, or what people call this migration. It's a forced migration. African Americans are going from the eastern seaboard and the Chesapeake region, and they're being forced to go to Mississippi and Alabama and Texas. And you can see this distribution here. In 1800, 24% lived in the Deep South. And by 1860, the end of the war, by the beginning of the war rather, 58% of all slaves live in the Deep South, and that's the cotton production. That you don't need all that. The slave population, as you can see, and you see it's still heavy in Virginia and on the coast here, but this is all relatively new here. And so with the advent of slavery in Mississippi and Alabama, now all of a sudden you have no need to keep the Indian population where they were living forever. And so you push them out as well too. So off to Oklahoma with Ye, and so they're gone too. So if you're familiar with the Trail of Tears, 1831 was a magical year for the Native American population. The Creeks, the Choctaws. So I go through all this already. The second Middle Passage, the cotton gin, right? Bless you. I love this picture, man. That is an honor. That's an honorary group. That is a group not to be trifled with. I'm sorry. I saw that picture. I said they have to be in this slide. Just a quick. What's that?
The kids look like they will hurt you.
Oh, absolutely right. Absolutely right. I love this picture for a lot of different reasons, though. But just a quick shout, and again, this is about African Americans during the Antebellum period. But they are the plain folks of the South affect African American life. They affect their experience. But these are some of the things. Oh, you can barely see this. I apologize. I'll read these to you. Slavery was instrumental in shaping race relations in the South. That should be obvious to everyone, but I thought I'd put it up there just for that, because it shaped it to the point of destruction. Because these so-called plain folks did not own slaves. And that's significant in that, why would they hate black slaves? What do they have to do with them? Well, I tell my students, I said, well, this is about economics. When you have an overwhelmingly powerful, I say powerful in the sense of labor, the black slave population, that black slave population made sure they didn't have any jobs. They did not, they worked for themselves. They were subsistent farmers and usually poor and middling people. And many of these people, the so-called plain folks, got up and left the South. When we talk about Southern white loyalty, and it's like, it wasn't quite that easy, because many of these people moved to places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, as a result of directly as a result of slavery. So anyway, this is terrible, I'm sorry. So it also shaped the politics, religion, and the law too. In short, facets of Southern life revolved around the institution in varying degrees. It affected people too. So yeah, this is just a big deal to them. These very poor people were very vastly affected by the institution itself. Okay. And I'll, just briefly here, just to go into slave life here, what you see, this is typical, and this is the slavery that we know when it comes to that Southern slavery in the third phase. Mortality rates were 3 times higher than the average person, 25% sick, or 25% more sick at the time. Roughly 15 to 20% of all slaves were so-called house slaves, that's slaves that worked in the house, that worked in close quarters with the masters and the master's family. And that could be good and bad, as you can probably imagine. You probably got more favors, but also you probably got more punishments, and oftentimes, which I'll get into, much sexual abuse was rampant if you lived in close quarters as a young woman. It was quite common. The most typical type of slave, and the most typical type of work, field slaves, 75% of all slaves were field slaves. They usually worked up to, actually that might be a bit generous, usually about 15 to 18 hours. I don't think that makes much of a difference at all though. After the 15th hour, I don't really care anymore. I'm just saying, I don't know. Also, they worked in what we call gang labor often. They always had an overseer, somebody, and that overseer could be black or white in some cases. It didn't matter because the whip didn't have a color. And often, these groups would sing songs. I mean, it was just a way to keep them occupied, to keep them, spiritually sound, I would imagine, too, right? As far as religion is concerned, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but by this time, by the 19th century, you start to see a very distinct and real Christian black community within the slave society. And interestingly, too, and I won't belabor this because of time constraints, but masters, white masters would often convert their slaves to Christianity because they believed it would be a way to subdue them. And in many cases, I guess it would be correct too, because the version of the Christianity that they were teaching them said that they were degraded people, that they were meant to be slaves, and so on and so forth. Also interestingly, so just to contradict that though, every single major revolt, slave revolt, was led by someone that was either a preacher, was literate, a preacher, a Christian preacher. So, I mean, it was kind of a contradiction too. So I don't know how black people were absorbing this. I don't know. But yeah, every revolt. Speaking of which, black resistance during the third phase. And this is just some of the ways that blacks were resisting. They were resisting the slave market, daily resistance on the plantation, runaways, violence. Most notable in 1831, during this third phase of slavery, the most infamous slave revolt by Nat Turner is famous not only for the amount of people that he killed, but also the fact that he talked about it afterwards. And that was just unusual. Usually they would capture these people and then they would kill them or hang them or whatever. But he actually had a chance to basically edit an entire book and talk about, what his thinking was. Most importantly, too, I guess, as far as slave societies, I'll conclude this pretty soon here. Every time there was a major slave revolt, there would be a major change in the restrictions on black people. And that would actually happen in the North as well, too, but it happened particularly in the South as well, and people continued to fear these revolts, and so they would have these tighter restrictions on the slaves and obviously on the free black population as well, too. And I mentioned this, too, that in the United States there's no revolutionary tradition, and what I mean by that, in comparison, in particular, when you think of places like the Caribbean, specifically Haiti, or Cuba, where there were revolts all the time, famously the Haitian Revolution under Toussaint. But yeah, there was no strong revolutionary tradition in the United States, and so my curious undergrad students say, well, why was that, Professor Ward? And I tell them, I said that had a lot to do with the population, the white population. One, in places like Haiti or in other places in Brazil, for example, there just simply tended to be less whites in those populations. There tended to be, blacks were outnumbered here. That was one. Two, goes back to the religious aspect as well, too. One thing about the religion of the people in the Caribbean and people outside of the United States, they all tended to not gravitate, but they all tended to be, what am I trying to say? They had African religions. They had religions that weren't Christian. And many historians, including myself, feel that there's a connection to that autonomy over who they were. They had their own names, they had their own religion, so they had a very strong sense of their own culture. And the fact that they were slaves tended to upset them. And many people argue that the reason why Christian slaves in these states did not revolt as much is because, again, this idea that they were somehow subdued, quote unquote. Again, it's hard to prove, but yeah, there just weren't that many revolts in comparison to what was taking place in other places outside of the United States. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead here and get to the end here. Oh, real quick. Daily resistance, one of my favorite parts here as well too. Many people feel that, or believe wrongly, that there was no resistance, daily resistance. But yeah, they broke tools almost on a daily basis. Somehow they were just trying to sabotage on a daily basis. Destruction of the fields, they would burn places down. And yeah, so there were all kinds of things, talking about how they would destroy as well too. I mentioned the runaways as well, attempting to locate families in many cases. Sometimes the master would pass away, sometimes the slaves would help the master pass away, right? Sometimes they would run away to avoid punishments, and so this takes us to our Underground Railroad briefly, that our star, they're avoiding punishment, and they were being beaten on a semi-daily basis, and part of the reason they wanted to leave is just simply because they didn't want to get beaten anymore. The Underground Railroad, that's my favorite thing right there. That thing is great. Let me give you this. I'll wrap it up here. The famous Underground Railroad must be placed within the context of increasing Southern white violence against black families, slave resistance, and aggressive Northern abolitionism. Because the Underground Railroad had to be a secret, and I love this too, let me stop myself too, because one of my undergrads pointed this out to me, and I never realized it. They said, hey Ward, did you realize that Frederick Douglass, in his book, the slave narrative that he wrote, the first one that he wrote, during this period of time, he said he didn't mention the Underground Railroad once. I said, yeah. I said, why do you think that is? I think because it was a secret at the time. I said, God. And I'm not kidding you, I hadn't thought about that. I was like, that's brilliant. So when Frederick Douglass writes this book in roughly 1840, 1841, this thing was such a secret that even he, in his very famous book, he couldn't say anything. Brilliant. Anyway, so it had to be a secret. Few details of how it operated were known. And Douglass, he proves that. He doesn't say, and he's heavily involved in the Underground Railroad at that time. Right? Slaves, since colonial times, had escaped from their masters, and free black people and some white people had actually assisted them. But the organized escape of slaves from the Chesapeake, Kentucky, and Missouri along predetermined routes to Canada became common only after the mid-1830s. And so some of the things, so you see this here too, this is, I love pointing this out too, because us, Illinois, we have like basically two routes going through our famous state here too, famously through Jacksonville as well too, Quincy, Illinois, Galesburg, Illinois. Yeah, and obviously they're going right up to Chicago, and sometimes they go straight through Chicago, they go right up to Canada. And that was a very typical route to escape slavery. And again, if you're paying attention here, Illinois, we're touching 3 slave states there. We got Missouri, we got Kentucky. Am I missing the one here too? No. We got 2, excuse me, Missouri and Kentucky are 2 slave states that are bordering our state. And yeah, that's significant. And that affected the free black population as well too. I don't have time to get into all of that too. Let me conclude here. The African American experience in the Antebellum era was wrought with many difficulties, obviously. Yet the black experience is also a history of people that persevered despite overwhelming obstacles placed before them. And the legacies they left behind continue to inspire Americans of all backgrounds. Thank you very much. I appreciate you. I'll go back. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Right there,
Mm-hmm.
and it has 2 rails. It's straight through St. Clair County.
Mm-hmm.
You have Alton, Granite City,
Right.
East St. Louis,
Mm-hmm.
Cahokia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm from.
Yeah.
I'm from Lovejoy, which is the first.
Lovejoy, of course. Yeah.
It's the first first town in Illinois, and the first town in the whole U.S. that was created and founded by African Americans.
By African Americans. Brooklyn, Illinois.
Yes, that's what it is.
Brooklyn, Illinois. That's right. That's right. Quick story, my dissertation advisor actually wrote the book on Brooklyn, Illinois. Sundiata Chajua. Yeah. Yeah. Brooklyn, Illinois. That's right, though. Yeah. Any other questions?
How deliberate, you might have addressed it because I came in a few minutes there, I'm sorry. How deliberate do you think was that shift that led to chattel slavery?
No.
I said, how deliberate, was the shift that you were explaining how it led to the official, especially like state by state, you know what I mean? Was it deliberate?
That's a great question. It's one I didn't necessarily cover in its entirety. I was using Virginia as my example because Virginia was basically seen as the leader as far as slavery was concerned. And what happens over time is that, quite frankly, planters found it to be more profitable to have a permanent base. They said, you know what, this isn't necessary, and this is what I tell my students too. I said, I would argue that this isn't necessarily about enslaving black people more than it was about gaining a permanent base, of gaining a permanent labor base. And what they can justify enslaving blacks. So they couldn't justify enslaving whites because of the religious thing, and plus, quite frankly, the obvious physical barrier in that case at least. And so, so you're asking, the transition itself was gradual. But what happens though, in Virginia in particular, and other states, other colonies at the time, they start to pick up on this thing. What they start to do is invent laws that really degrade black people, that say that step by step, and most importantly, they separate whites and blacks, because one of the things that the elite feared more than anything, and I mentioned this with Bacon's Rebellion, they feared this biracial union that was actually happening. And so what I try to tell my students as well too, I say, racism, we say what we say about it, but it wasn't natural. There was no natural hatred between it. In fact, they created laws to keep the people apart. Interracial marriage was made illegal. So if you make something illegal, that means it was happening. Right? You can't do that anymore. Well, if it was never happening, you would have to make a law for it. And so one thing, again, and I'm belaboring the point here, but an attempt to make these people inferior in order to justify their enslavement. That's basically what happens here. And Virginia does it so well that other states, other colonies follow suit soon after, Maryland in particular. Yes, sir.
What's your take on the Dred Scott decision? How dramatic was that?
One of the biggest, one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions ever, in 1857. It basically was that under Patrick Buchanan, President Buchanan. One of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions, and what it basically said to Northerners is that all hell is about to break loose, and we know that it's all fair game. Dred Scott was brought up here, I think from Missouri, to Illinois, and what Dred Scott was suing for is that, hey man, that's a free state. You can't do this. I'm not a slave anymore. And what Northerners and abolitionists and Republicans feared at that time is like, well, you know, all hell's going to break loose. You can take a slave anywhere, and they're enslaved, or they remain a slave, and you can have slavery in Illinois in that case, or in other free states. And so, I mean, I don't know if that I mean, what did you think of it? I mean, in terms of?
Yeah, I thought it changed, drastically, because that meant that blacks at that time had no rights. It made sure that they were chattel.
Right.
And that there wasn't much hope at that time.
Absolutely right. I mean, and I always, when I think about the Dred Scott decision, I always think about the fact that, you know, it's impossible to, well, no, not impossible, but what it says is that, you know, now, as black people, we live in this free state, but it's not necessarily a free state, because here we have Dred Scott right here who's enslaved. What's gonna happen to me, you know, possibly? And so, yeah, I think just the balance that it struck, or the imbalance that it strikes at that very critical time in 1857, yeah, it's just crucial. And yeah, just another thing leading to, obviously, the Civil War, right?
Well, doesn't Dred Scott also require the law enforcement in the North to cooperate? To cooperate,
that's right.
They're making the North complicit then in the slave system.
Well, Professor Kunis, they had done that 7 years earlier with the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, saying that, hey, look, we're requiring our white population in the North to go help us capture these runaway slaves as well, too. And so, yeah, so the Dred Scott decision by itself is powerful, but it's even more powerful on top of everything that was going on. The Fugitive Slave Act. You can even go before that too, with the Mexican War, and then where they were trying to take slavery at that point. But the 1850 Fugitive Act, what was happening in Kansas, bleeding Kansas in 1856. Yeah, so these things kept snowballing. Obviously, Harper's Ferry with John Brown. You know, and all these things added up, and yeah, it culminated in the Civil War too. Of course, everybody knows that too, though. I don't know. Ladies first, Christian. Yes. Naomi, go ahead.
Back to the Chesapeake, and I forgot his first name, Johnston.
Oh, Anthony, yes.
Yeah. Did he have descendants? And if so, what happened to
Great
them?
question, too. And let me tell you something. You know, historians are terrible people. So that story's been told many times. But my students think it's just the greatest thing in the world. But that story's been told many times. And Anthony Johnson is quite famous, quite frankly. And so there's a lot of information on him. But yes, he has a wife. He has children. And and quite frankly, they carry on the house. They owned a lot of land, and they owned a lot of animals. And I'll keep it. The sad part of it is, you know, as race relations erode, as blacks' rights erode as well too, they eventually take that land from them, from their descendants, eventually. And so yeah, it just eventually. But Anthony Johnson had died. Like that, I think that was his great grandchild that eventually lost the land, but it was taken from them.
They didn't get re-enslaved, or did they?
No, not that we know of. Evidence doesn't say that they got re-enslaved, but they certainly lost that land, and that in itself is a shame because they worked so hard to get it.
After they gave it to them.
After they gave it to them, right? Yes, I agree. Christian?
I was really fascinated by the tension you brought in Virginia about the introduction of slavery having as much to do with kind of the separation and alliance of blacks and disenfranchised whites and trying to drive a wedge between that.
Sure.
That's interesting to see there at the inception. As slavery goes on into the third period, into Jim Crow and things like that, do you see that same tension as being something that's at the heart of some of those kinds of things, or was it so baked in at that point that that wasn't a fear of any?
That's a fantastic question, and one thing I didn't really drive home here is how racism grows and grows and grows. Actually, what's the opposite of growing? It should be a deterioration, right? But it's almost to the point, and that's why, I guess that's why I brought up the plain white folk of the South, because by that time, the racism is baked in. And one thing I keep going back to my students. I love those guys, apparently. But I keep going back to my students here. One thing I tell them is how this thing, the fact that they have to legally separate the races. I mean, that they literally do that. Saying that you guys cannot be together anymore. You can't hang out together. You can't marry together. That should tell you something right there. Secondly, you can't underestimate the legalization of, let's say, Christian has on a light green shirt. And if we, as a group, a powerful group, make a law saying that people with sunglasses and light green shirts are, illegal people, there's something wrong with them or whatever, we, as a group, will say, okay, that's Alonzo, that's really silly, but we're going to say we're going to arrest him anyway. Over time, however, our children, our grandchildren, people buy into this. Christian in those green shirts, they're all bad. And that's what happened with racism. That's what happened with black people. You kept them, they were enslaved, and at one point, whites were enslaved with them. And they were brothers, they were comrades. But once you separated them, and once you made laws against those people, degrading them and telling everybody that they're inferior by law, that they would be whipped, they would be punished more, that they would be, bad things would happen to them, you can feed racism.
As a kind of a follow-up clarification then, so like in 1840s, Southern plantation owner, would the fact that black slaves and poor whites might somehow form an alliance, was that still at the front of their mind, or was that racism was so baked in at that point, nobody was worried about that?
So I say all of what I said because those alliances still happened.
Okay.
In spite of everything. So it was still possible. It still happened. It just was less typical. I can't make it any simpler than that though. Yeah. So were the elites, were the planters worried about that? I'm sure to some extent they're still. It had to be, of course.
Okay.
But in 1660 Virginia, that was a major possibility that these poor whites and these poor blacks who work side by side all the time and they drink together, apparently they sleep together too, and that was a problem. But as long as you kept them separate, it quickly dissipated.
Divide and conquer, because
Sure.
Because the more that gets together, the more that other bunch is afraid.
Sure.
Because the ones that's controlling this, if more of their slaves get together, that's going to overpower them, and that's one thing that they're afraid of. So
Right.
I can't have that group right there over here
Over
with
here.
that group.
Right.
Because if those two groups came together, that whole yard would have been there.
And many people would argue that the same type of dividing and conquering continues to this day too. Though many people would argue that. I might be one of them as well too. So, any other? Oh, sure.
So, what sort of danger would the white people that were trying to enable the slaves to get free, what kind of danger were they in, and what kind of punishment would they?
Not good. So a benevolent white family helping out slaves, let's say on the Underground Railroad. Oh, not good at all. I mean, I don't know what the punishment would be specifically, but really not good for them. Not good. I mean, obviously the slaves would probably encounter a much harsher punishment just because they're slaves, they're black, and they're runaways. But the white family, I mean, there were many cases where whites were hung as a result of helping.
That was kind of my question.
Sure.
There's thousands of miles traveled to get to the railroad, so they had to have some help.
And actually, one of the things I love about Colson's book too, I mean, even though he uses poetic license, and, but there's some real stuff going on in there as well too, and he talks about, many of the conductors of the so-called conductors, and these were not real trains, we know that, but the so-called conductors, people helping and leading these, it's often white people, often.
It's funny my husband asked that question because I know I've told him about stories from my family, the Barr family in Texas on my father's side, and they were living in Texas at the time, and after Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation, of course it only freed slaves in the South, but he only had a couple of slaves. I say a couple, but he was, had a lot of family, and I don't know what his reason for letting the slaves go if he was sympathetic,
Wow.
which that's what the family always says. You
Sure.
know, or if he saw political wins, you know, or if he just thought they were extra mouths to feed. I don't know, but you know,
That's interesting.
he
though.
let them go. There were 2 of them, and they made their, you know, way of freedom. But they lived on a farm outside of town,
Wow.
and that was this mob, you know, kind of said, oh, we're gonna make them what do you call it? Or the man, an example. Don't do that. Don't ever, you know. And
Wow.
so they went and they burned his, you know, he had several children and a
Wow.
wife. They hung him, burned everything,
Sure.
animals, everything, but the family escaped and came to Illinois
Wow.
to become poor dirt farmers, but they had nothing. So
Wow.
Yeah.
Am I understanding you correctly, though, that your descendants were killed
yes,
as a result of
Yes.
emancipating their slaves?
yeah, he was hung.
Because he let his own slaves go.
Wow. Because he let his own slaves go.
Right, he
Wow.
let his own slaves go. And
Wow.
so with so within a couple days, you know, the word got back to town and they decided to form a mob and kind of make him an example.
Wow.
Since he was helping those others gather more help.
No, because he freed his own.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
He did his own.
Sure.
And when he did that, he gave more, you can say, more ammunition
That's
to
true.
the other team.
Right, I get it. I get you.
And
I get
since he
you.
helped them,
Mhm.
they're speaking that he's against those other ones, so he doesn't deserve it.
Mhm. Plus, he's setting a bad example. He's just setting a bad example. Period. Right?
There's
People
still
like,
a war
hey.
on, too.
What's that?
Yeah, there's still a war on.
There's still a war on too, as well. Right? That's interesting. Though. Wow.
I have a
Yes.
question. You said when Frederick Douglass wrote his first book, which
Yeah.
was around 1848.
If I'm not mistaken, if anybody wants to correct me on the date
well,
of Frederick
just
Douglass.
general.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
he didn't disclose this underground.
No, he did not, and,
So
and
when
that
did
student
they-
was right. Yeah.
When did they believe this all got started? Was it always in the underground?
Oh, no,
railroad?
no, no, no. And there's evidence to suggest that it started as early as the 1820s, as far as runaway slaves. Some semblance of an underground railroad, you know, where people, benevolent people, whites in many cases, were helping slaves escape.
So it would have been at its strongest.
Oh, by
right
the
before the
1840s and
war.
1850s, it was running, it was cooking, it was, yeah, I mean, no, it was one of the baddest operations.
Okay.
No, I mean, and again, if
It
you
was an
read,
express.
what's that?
I said it was an express.
It really, no, it really was an express, and it frustrated the heck out of slave owners and Southern whites in general. They were quite frustrated by the efficiency and the effectiveness of the Underground Railroad itself. And I didn't mention one of my favorite people, one of the conductors of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, who bravely, this feeble old woman went back and forth at least 15 times to the south from the north to help free slaves. I mean, just not physically the strongest person in the world, but yeah.
Well,
But she was a part of that
suspect
underground.
her.
What's that? I'm sorry.
They wouldn't suspect her if she was, you know.
I guess not. I guess. Yeah, but I guess not. But yeah, she was famous for the amount of trips that she made too. Yeah.
In the time period before that transition to chattel slavery, have you come across in your research a term called Melungeons? Has anyone heard of the Melungeons?
Melungeons? No.
Yeah, Tennessee, Carolinas area.
Heard of that? Were they kind of a mixed race?
Yeah, like a mixed race people, but they were free and freely mixing a little bit later into the
Well,
time.
I mean, there was a strong Creole population in Virginia as well too, and obviously this would go down into Louisiana as well too, in places like that. But Melungeons?
Melungeons.
No, I'm not familiar. But a biracial group, free blacks.
I found one source that cites it, and I haven't found anyone else that even mentions them. But my family name is Evans, and the surname kind of goes back to this free population they were mixed race, but mostly black from what I've heard.
Spell it for me, please.
I
I'm not put you on the spot. I'm sorry. It's terrible.
We'll fill it in.
Melungeon.
yeah.
That's interesting because I want to look that up immediately.
I'm looking it up right now.
Somebody, yes. Questions anymore? Oh,
Okay, well, I was gonna say, be sure to pick up a schedule scope of all of the events that go along with Colson Whitehead's visit on September 12th, which includes 2 book discussions next month that are going to be co-led by Dr. Ward. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
You ride your bike? Here's for you. Before dark. Today.
So were you guys buds when you lived in Jacksonville? No, she came down before. Oh, okay. There's so many nice to meet you. With their dads.
So you must love history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Kids going off to What are you going to study? Psychology. Where are you headed? Also, not too far away. No, 45 minutes.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Thanks for buying us a carrot.
No, it's a great question. And the time one thing I think is strength of black family on black people on slave plantations, the black family. Secondly, you couldn't hang your hat on. I love my mother while I have her. What did you do? Yeah, I mean, and so and there were many cases where there were cohesive units. Yeah, sometimes some rule masters would separate them. Yeah. One thing about a large plantation is that obviously not only your immediate, but you have other relatives. What do you call it? Extended family, right? Religion played a major part, and maybe I didn't emphasize it enough.
Well, religion is the whole strange animal in this whole thing.
It sure is, but it also, while it may have been used as a weapon against black slaves in many cases, but black slaves also used it as a weapon for themselves or some kind of spiritual comfort for themselves. And so while a slave master would get something out of this, you know, by subduing his slaves into, you know, believing they were inferior. But slaves often use that religion as a spiritual uplift. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so,
Knowing what you know.
that wasn't, you said five or less.
Well, just not saying he's a former pastor, don't believe a word.
Knowing what you know, not just the but it should.
I don't have those.